So this area to the right of the screen, this is called your Properties panel. And this is not to be confused with the Properties shelf. So if you press T, when you're out here in the 3D view, this brings up your Tool Shelf menu and your Properties shelf menu. I know it's a bit confusing that this is called the Properties shelf and this is the Properties panel, but just want you to be aware of that minor difference. So let's go ahead and press T to dismiss our shelves there. And over here on our Properties panel, by default, it starts out on the Modifiers tab. So we have all these different tabs which will change what type of information our Properties panel is displaying. So for instance, we have this Render tab, we have a Scene tab, a World tab, and so on. But by default, we start out on this Modifiers tab. And if we click this Add Modifier button, it will bring up this drop-down menu of all these different modifiers we can add to our object. The term modifier is pretty self-explanatory. Basically, it's like adding an item to your object, which either changes some property of that object, but usually changes the way that object looks visually. So another important thing to note about modifiers is that they are non-destructive. Basically, what that means is you can add a modifier to your object, but it doesn't permanently change that object until you apply that modifier. Once you apply the modifier will disappear and your object will be permanently changed. So another way to think about this is sort of imagine that each object you have selected is like a video game character, and say that character's attack strength is like 80 or something, just some arbitrary value. And if we add the item of a sword to that character, then his attack power becomes 100. But if you were to remove that sword, then it would go back down to 80. So basically giving the sword to the character does not permanently raise that character's attack strength, but instead it modifies the character. So in this way, we can add all kinds of different modifiers to do different things to our objects. And if you want, you can sort of think about these modifiers even as your inventory. If you want to, think about Blender as being kind of like a game or something, here's your inventory of different items that you can equip to your character, your object, your whatever you're building. It doesn't have to be an actual character. It could be a car or a tire or whatever you're making in 3D. But you can think of this almost as an inventory of things to add to your object. And of course, each effect builds on all the other effects, so you can get many different total effects out of adding and mixing different kinds of modifiers. The modifiers under this Modify heading to the far left, this is pretty advanced stuff. These are not things that you will be using on a daily basis for the most part. And the items under the Simulate category, these are also pretty advanced modifiers that we're not going to be getting into immediately. But definitely the modifiers under the Generate title here and the modifiers under this Deform title here. These two rows are going to be your main workhorse of modifiers that you will be using a lot in Blender. So we're going to focus a lot on these early on. So I'm going to press X to delete this default cube and press Shift A, and under Mesh add a plane. So over here, if we click our Add Modifier button, let's go ahead and add a Solidify Modifier to this plane and see what it does. So if I click that, if we zoom in real close, we can see that this plane is now got some depth to it. And if I adjust this thickness value, I can change how thick this Solidify modifier affects this plane. So if we were to click the Modifier Visibility button to hide the effect of this Solidify modifier right there, then we can no longer see what that modifier is doing to the plane. But here is this Solidify modifier. Of course, anything we have selected in the 3D view, its set of modifiers, if it has any, will show up on this Modifier tab of our Properties panel here. So for instance, if I were to double right click over here and under Mesh add Monkey Shape, notice that there are no longer any modifiers. So these modifiers are only related to what object we have selected. So let's go ahead and delete this monkey head, press X, and then back over here on our plane, we can see our Solidify modifier here, and let's turn the visibility of that effect back on by clicking this eye icon. Let's press Tab to go into edit mode, press Shift scroll up for edge selection, and then let's just click on one of these edges, and let's hit E to extrude, hold middle mouse to constrain to bring this up. And you see when we do that, as we add new mesh to this object, the modifier continues to dynamically adjust its effect on the object. Once again, if we turned off the visibility there, here's what our actual object looks like, and here's what the effect of that modifier, the Solidify, looks like. Well, let's hit E to extrude again and middle mouse to constrain, and I'm just going to make some real simple kind of steps here. So real quickly, what these buttons up here do, we talked about how this eye icon hides the visibility of the modifier's effect in the 3D view. This little camera icon will hide the modifier's effect when we go to render. So I could have the visibility in the 3D view on, but if I were to turn off visibility of the render effect, then if we were to click our render button right here, where these steps are, then these would just appear flat because we have decided to hide the effect of the Solidify modifier. So if I were just to press my render button here, then we see this is not made thick by the Solidify modifier because we're hiding the effect. So I could click it back on and press my render button again. And in this one, we see that it is actually rendering with that effect active. So I'll press my go back button here. Then this button right here, this makes sure that we can see the effects of the modifier if we're in edit mode. So if I were to turn that off, we would not see the effects of this modifier because we are in edit mode. But if we were to press Tab, the instant we go back into object mode, then we can see the effects. So if we press Tab to go back into edit mode, we don't. So usually we'd like to keep that on because typically, unless you're having difficulty making a selection while you're in edit mode, you may want to turn that off. And then finally to the far right over here, this turns on cage editing. And with cage editing selected, Blender treats the entire object, including those effects of the modifier, as though one complete mesh object. So if I were to turn that on, then we can adjust the entire object as though this modifier were applied, even though it's still not applied, and we have the option of removing it, changing it, or changing its position or something like that. But I'll go ahead and turn that off for now. So let's go ahead and add another modifier. I'm going to click this little button here, which allows me to hide each modifier's options, which this is really helpful because after a while you may have a couple of modifiers on here and can get really crowded. So under Add Modifier, I'm going to select Bevel. As you can see, what the bevel does is it splits every edge of the object to create a smoothing effect. So if we were to increase the amount of segments, or the amount of times really that the edges are being split, we get smoother and smoother results. We can also control the width of this bevel. You can see it gets bigger and smaller. And I'm going to bring those segments down to 3 for now because that will be good. Just like our Solidify modifier here, we can also at any point hide the effects of this modifier, or we could move this modifier below the Solidify modifier. And notice that as soon as I do that, we have a completely different result. So the order of which these modifiers are stacked is very important and very relative to your end result. So if you're ever trying something and you're getting really weird results, sometimes that's because you may not have your modifiers correctly positioned. So I'll go ahead and click this up button to move this Solidify modifier back up under here. The reason why that was happening is because each descending modifier treats the object plus the effects of all the modifiers as though it were applied. So if we were to hide the effects of both of these modifiers, here is what our core object actually looks like. But when I turn the visibility of this Solidify modifier back on, and then turn the visibility of the Bevel modifier back on, this bottom modifier is treating the object in addition to whatever modifiers are above it as though it were applied, and it is now changing that object plus the effects of all the previous modifiers overall. So I'm going to press T to bring up my tool shelf and property shelf here, and I'm going to press Tab to go back into object mode and press smooth. This smooth button will change our object from flat shading to smooth shading, which does a better job of concealing these edges. So we can change that back by pressing flat, or we can keep it on smooth, which I want to do for now. So I'm going to hide the options of this bevel modifier, and under add modifier, this time I'm going to add an array. You can kind of think of an array modifier as sort of a cloner, and we can control how many times that the object is being cloned under this count. So right now it's just 2, so there's only 1 additional incarnation of our object. So we could increase this count button here or decrease it like this. And then the other important part to the array modifier is the offset. So this is basically saying, okay, I'm making these clones, however many you want, 15, that's fine. So where do I put them? And this is saying exactly 1 times the width of this object over along the x-axis. So if we kind of scroll up this value here under the x offset, you can see how that moves the spacing between the cloned iterations of the object. Or we could click on this and then type in 0 to put in the value for 0. And now actually all 15 of these are sitting in the same spot. And we could adjust this value, or we could adjust the Z value, which controls kind of the up and down placement of them. We can mix these values also to get kind of different results. But if you want the cloning to go only in one direction, then just keep 2 of these set to 0 and the one you want to use with a value. So I'm going to go ahead and put 0 for Z, 0 for Y, and increase this back to exactly 1. That way these are all going across in a row and continue to stay directly next to each other. And so I'm going to click on add modifier here again, and I'm going to add a simple deform modifier. And let's go ahead and close up the options for this array modifier so we can keep our workspace kind of nice. So simple deform modifiers, what they do is allow you to choose one of these 4 different methods of kind of warping your mesh in a pretty simple way. So you can control this by just adjusting this angle here under deform. And so that's what we got going on with twist. And then we have the option to taper, which you can control the factor for that as well. And of course, I would suggest, trying this simple deform modifier out on different kinds of objects so you can get a better idea of how these different methods work. Typically, the one I use most often is bend. So we're going to set this to bend and increase this angle as far as it will go, which happens to be 180 degrees. And if we try to make it go further than that, it just won't, because Blender by default has a clamp on this set to 180. If ever that happens, if ever you're trying to increase a value in Blender like this and it seems to be stopping you, typically these values can be overridden if you just click on them and then manually enter the value you want. So for instance, I really want this to be 360 degrees, so I'm going to type in 360 and then hit enter. And so now we've got this modifier bending this object in a full 360 degrees. So if we were to expand our array modifier again, we could actually increase the count. That is the amount of times that the kind of clone instances of the array are being increased or decreased. And we could also adjust these bevel values or hide the effects of any one of these. And notice that when I hide the effect of the bevel modifier, we get this really kind of weird effect going on. And that's because we had changed this to smooth shading. And so typically smooth shading works best if you have a subdivision surface modifier or using a bevel or something like that. But with just very simple, plain, very small amount of faces objects, it'll look kind of weird. So if we were to press flat, that would look normal again. But we'll put it back on smooth and then turn the visibility of that bevel modifier back on. So as I was saying, each descending modifier treats all the modifiers above it as though they had already been applied to the object. For instance, if I were to go up here and press apply on that Solidify modifier, it disappears because the core object, the object underneath all the effects of these modifiers, has now been permanently changed by that Solidify modifier. And so if I turn the visibility of the bevel back on and press apply there, then we press tab to go back into edit mode, we see now that the mesh is reflecting its new shape from having that bevel modifier fully applied. So it's gone now, and this is the final way this object looks. And then so if I turn the visibility of the array modifier back on, and if I were to apply that, which you can't apply modifiers when in edit mode, as Blender is reminding me here. So press tab to go back into object mode and press apply. So if you're going to apply your array modifier, just be real sure that you are happy with the results and that you're not going to need to decrease or increase your count value. That is how many times the object's being cloned, because once it's applied, you can't change it anymore. So now if we press tab to go into edit mode, we'll see that our object has been changed even more by this array modifier when we applied it. So I'll press tab to go back into object mode. And if we turn the visibility of our simple deform modifier back on, we have our end result here. So notice that with all those modifiers applied, this simple deform modifier is making our object look exactly the same as it was, even though we didn't have those applied. And that is because, once again, every descending modifier treats all the other modifiers and the object as though they were applied, even though they're not. So there's a lot more stuff we can do, and obviously I didn't get into every detail of the modifiers we did use, but I hope that helps give you a basic understanding of what modifiers are, how powerful they are, and I highly encourage you to do some of your own personal research on these modifiers on the internet, especially the ones you find in this generate and deform categories, because as someone who's new or fairly new to Blender, these are the ones you should definitely focus on first and get kind of an idea of and play around with.